They told me the swamp wasn't like other places, but I didn't listen. I laughed off the rules and treated the stories like folklore. That was before I saw the shadows move without a source. Before I realized the paths were alive, shifting beneath my feet. Before the swamp took something from me, something I'll never get back. It wasn't the kind of job you find on a job board. I was drifting back then, hopping between gigs, scraping by. Then I found myself in this forgotten little town, a dot on the map, with more trees than people. Could feel the weight of it, even in the air. I met Mr. Harlan at the only bar in town, a dimly lit hole in the wall that smelled like wet wood, and old beer. He was sitting alone, nursing a drink, when he looked up at me and said, "You, good with directions?" I shrugged. "I guess. You scared of the dark?" "No," I lied. That was the interview. He didn't care about my name, my experience, or why I'd ended up there. He slid a card across the table. 3 rules, written in thick, blocky letters. Number 1, never guide more than 8 people. Number 2, never let anyone stray from the group. Number 3, leave by midnight, no matter what. He told me, follow the rules and you'll be fine. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, and muttered, "Probably." At the time, it felt like a strange but easy job. I mean, it was just a swamp, right? Trees, water, maybe a few gators. What was the worst that could happen? I didn't know then that the rules weren't there to keep the tourists safe. They were there to keep the swamp satisfied. It started like every other tour, or at least I thought it did. 6 people showed up that night. They'd seemed normal enough, except for Margaret. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with a calm, knowing look in her eyes. She didn't ask questions like the others. She just stared at the swamp, like she'd been there before. The swamp felt different as soon as we entered. The fog hung low, thick and heavy, wrapping around our ankles like it wanted to pull us in. The air wasn't just humid, it was suffocating. Even the usual chorus of frogs and insects was muted, replaced by an eerie silence. About halfway through the tour, someone pointed at the water. "What's that?" I turned my flashlight toward the ripples. It wasn't a gator. It wasn't anything I could explain. The movement was slow, deliberate, like something was circling us just beneath the surface. "Probably nothing," I said, forcing a laugh, but my voice wavered, and Margaret noticed. She stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "You shouldn't laugh at it," she said. "The swamp doesn't like being mocked." I wanted to dismiss her, but there was something in her tone, a warning, sharp and cold. And then I heard it, a faint sound, like someone calling my name. It came from the water, but when I turned my flashlight back, the ripples were gone. The swamp was silent again, but the weight in the air had doubled. It wasn't just a quiet night. I felt like the swamp was waiting, watching, and it was just the beginning. Todd had always been the loud one, cocky, brash, always with a joke. "It's just trees and mud," he said, stepping off the trail despite my warnings. His voice echoed through the mangroves, mocking and carefree, and then it stopped. At first, I thought he was messing with us, waiting to jump out and scare someone. "Todd?" I called, my flashlight sweeping through the trees. There was no answer. The group tensed, their laughter dying in their throats. Someone whispered, "Where did he go?" I stepped closer to where he had been, scanning the ground for footprints. A disturbance in the mood, anything. The only thing I found was his flashlight, flickering weakly, its beam cutting through the fog like a shaky breath. That's when we heard it. "Todd," a woman called, her voice trembling. From somewhere deep in the swamp, his voice answered, faint and distant. It didn't sound right. It was flat, emotionless, like a recording played back on a warped cassette. The direction was all wrong, coming from a part of the swamp where he couldn't have gone. Not unless he could walk through water without making a sound. I felt something shift, an oppressive weight in the air pressing down on my chest. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. Margaret grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's too late," she whispered. "You left him wander. Now the swamp is awake." Her words didn't make sense, but they sent a chill down my spine. "Todd!" someone shouted, louder this time. His voice came again, closer now, but wrong. So, Ron, who turned, flashlights darting into the fog. Shadows flickered, moving where there should have been nothing. "We need to leave. Now." Margaret's words rang in my ears as we hurried down the path, the group close behind me. The swamp is awake. Awake. What did that even mean? But the swamp had changed. The paths, once familiar and well-worn, now twisted and turned, like they were leading us in circles. The trees loomed larger, their gnarled branches weaving together into shapes that almost looked like... "Are we lost?" someone asked, their voice tight with panic. "No," I lied. "Just stay close." The whispers started as faint murmurs, barely audible over the squelch of our boots in the mud. At first I thought it was just the wind slipping through the trees. Then I heard my name. It was soft, almost a sigh. "Come here." I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I swept it across the trees. Nothing. Just endless fog and twisted branches. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp. I heard. I trailed off, shaking my head. "It's nothing. Keep moving." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, overlapping until they filled my head. My heart pounded as I stumbled forward, feeling the air grow heavier with each step. The group huddled close, their fear palpable. One woman started crying, the sound muffled, behind her hand. Another man muttered prayers under his breath. Margaret stepped ahead of me, her expression grim. "It's not just a swamp," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It's alive, it watches, and it takes." I wanted to call her crazy, but I couldn't deny what I was feeling. The oppressive weight, the twisting paths, the whispers that seemed to come from inside my own head. From somewhere behind us, Todd's voice called again, closer now. "Help me." We didn't turn around. We couldn't. The swamp wasn't letting us leave. The mangrove circle was deathly quiet, as though the swamp was holding its breath, waiting for us to act. "Live," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You have to give it something that matters." The group hesitated, but fear outweighed logic. One by one they stepped forward, leaving their offerings. A wedding ring, a crumpled photograph, a worn pocket knife. Each item disappeared into the roots of the mangrove, swallowed by the mud as if the swamp was feeding on them. Then it was my turn. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing against the cold, worn metal of my father's compass. He'd given it to me when I was a kid, telling me it would always guide me home. It was all I had left of him, a tether to the man who vanished without a trace. The swamp seemed to grow heavier, the air pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. "You don't have a choice," Margaret said, her eyes locked on mine. I stepped forward, kneeling at the base of the mangrove. My hands trembled as I placed the particulo compass in the mud. The stillness was worse. The swamp exhaled, the sound a low, guttural rumble that made the ground vibrate beneath our feet. Then we saw it. A shadow rose from the water, towering and amorphous, its edges flickering like smoke. It had no face, but the weight of its gaze was unmistakable. "Don't move," Margaret whispered. But it wasn't enough. The shadow loomed over us, silent but suffocating. Its presence felt alive, shifting and pulsating, like a living thing. I couldn't tell if it was made of smoke, or liquid, or something in between, but its edges seemed to ripple, bleeding into the fog. Margaret stepped forward, her expression unnervingly calm. "It's not enough," she said, more to herself than to us. "What do you mean?" I hissed, my voice shaking. She turned to me, her eyes glinting with a strange, resigned sadness. "It needs more." Before I could react, Margaret began walking toward the shadow. The swamp water rippled around her legs, the mud sucking at her feet. "Margaret, no!" I shouted, but she didn't stop. She paused just before the shadow, tilting her head as though she could hear something we couldn't. The shadow consumed her. It didn't lunge or attack. It simply enveloped her, pulling her into itself like she was sinking into tar. The group screamed, backing away as the swamp seemed to groan, a deep, resonant sound. That shook the trees, and then it was quiet. The shadow lingered for a moment, its edges rippling, before it slowly receded back into the water. The swamp exhaled, the oppressive weight lifting slightly, but the air was still thick with dread. "She's gone," someone whispered. I didn't respond. I couldn't. "Run!" The word came out before I even realized I'd said it. The group didn't hesitate. We bolted, our flashlights slicing through the fog as we scrambled back toward the trailhead. The paths, once twisted and confusing, seemed clearer now, But that didn't mean we were safe. Shadows flickered in the trees, darting between branches with unnatural speed. The whispers were back, louder and more insistent, echoing in my head like a cacophony of voices. "Keep going," I shouted, my lungs burning as I pushed forward. Then I tripped. The ground rose up to meet me, sharp and unforgiving. My flashlight flew from my hand, its beam spinning wildly before settling on the water. And there he was. My father, or at least something that looked like him. He stood ankle-deep in the water, his clothes soaked and clinging to his frame. His face was calm, almost serene, but his eyes were wrong. They were empty, dark voids that seemed to pull at me, drawing me closer. "Come with me," he said, his voice soft and familiar. For a moment I froze. It was him. It had to be. But then I saw the water around him ripple unnaturally, moving in tandem with his words. Outstretched hand twitched, the fingers curling in a way no human hand should. Then, "Come home," he repeated. Something in me snapped. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my flashlight and running without. Looking back, the whispers turned to screams, the shadows lunging toward me. But I didn't stop, until I saw the faint glow of the trailhead lights. Webb burst out of the swamp just as dawn began to break, collapsing onto the dirt. But even in the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp wasn't done with me. I thought the swamp was behind me, that escaping its roots and shadows meant I was free. For days I refused to speak about what happened, the others who survived, what few there, and all the time leading up to it, I felt it. The gravity, our senses, the cold, did the same. It was easier to pretend it never happened, to let the silence cover the terror like a layer of mud. Then, a week later, I found the compass. It was sitting on my doorstep, gleaming as though it had never touched the swamp's filth. My stomach dropped as I bent to pick it up, the cold metal almost burning against my skin. It was a note, the handwriting shaky, almost childlike. "You owe us more." The whispers started again that night. At first they came from the shadows of my bedroom, soft and distant, almost like wind. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, closer, until they seemed to press against my ears. And then there were the dreams. Every night, I was back in the swamp, standing in the mangrove circle. My father stood in the chimcha, water, his eyes black pits, his mouth curling into an unnatural smile. "Come back," he whispered. "It's waiting." But it wasn't just in the dreams. The shadows in my house stretched too far. My reflection in the tree hose, the shouts, the yelling. Mirror lagged just slightly, but enough to make my skin crawl. And the whispers, those damn whispers, were no longer just at night. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know. The swamp doesn't forget. It doesn't let go. I don't think it ever wanted Margaret or Todd or even me. It wants something more. If you're reading this, check your doors, your windows, your shadows, and tell me, are you sure you're alone? If you dare, share this story, but remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. I was instructed to light a candle in every room before sunset, with strict warnings not to miss. Even one, attic, creaked with a presence I couldn't see but knew was there. Something was watching, hidden in the dark. This wasn't how I planned to spend my weekend. It wasn't even how I'd imagined reconnecting with Ethan, a childhood friend I hadn't heard from in nearly a decade. When I opened the letter, he said, I thought it had to be a mistake, an elaborate prank, maybe. Ethan always had a knack for weird jokes. But as I read the words, the tone of his letter left no room for laughter. I need your help. Just stay in my cabin for one night. It's important. I'll explain everything later. What made it stranger was the set of rules he included, written neatly on a separate piece of paper. Number 1. Light a candle in every room before sunset. Number 2. Never enter the attic. Number 3. Ignore any knocking after midnight. Number 4. Leave by sunrise. At first, I dismissed the letter. I hadn't spoken to Ethan in years, and even when we were kids, he was the kind of person who could convince others to do just about anything. But something about his words stayed with me, an unshakable urgency woven into each sentence. Maybe it was the fact that my life was a mess at the time. Work had become unbearable, every day dragging into the next without purpose. Relationships? non-existent. My world had shrunk into an exhausting cycle of waking, working, and collapsing into bed. When I read the letter, again, it almost felt like an invitation to escape. I could already hear my coworkers teasing me if they found out. You're driving to a random mountain cabin because of a weird letter from someone you barely know? Sounds like a horror movie setup. But what if it wasn't? What if it was a lifeline? The idea burrowed into my mind and wouldn't let go. The thought of stepping out of my monotonous routine, even for one night, was too tempting. The rules were bizarre, but I convinced myself they were harmless quirks, a product of Ethan's odd sense of humor. I packed a bag, throwing in essentials, clothes, snacks, a flashlight, my phone charger. When I finally started the drive up the mountain road, the world seemed to change around me. The trees grew thicker, their twisted branches blotting out the late afternoon sun. The sound of my engine was the only thing breaking the suffocating silence. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The occasional cabin or parked car disappeared the higher I went. By the time I reached the top, the road had narrowed to little more than a dirt path, bordered by towering pines. And then I saw it. The cabin. It stood at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by trees so dense, it looked like they were guarding it. At first glance, it was perfect. Almost too perfect. The wooden beams were smooth and polished, the windows practically sparkling. It looked like the kind of place someone would take a vacation to escape the chaos of city life. But the longer I stared, the more uneasy I felt. There was something about the way it sat in the clearing, almost too still, like it didn't belong there. When I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned under my weight, sending a shiver through me. Forget the rules. And whatever happens, trust the candles. The cabin welcomed me with an eerie silence. When I opened the door, the faint scent of wax hit me immediately, clinging to the air like smoke from a candle long extinguished. Inside, everything was perfect. Too perfect. The furniture was clean, almost sterile. The living room was arranged like a staged photo from a real estate ad, with no signs of anyone having lived there. But as I looked closer, little details started to unravel the picture. Scratches ran along the edges of the door frames, deep grooves that didn't match the pristine walls. Kitchen counter caught my eye, circular and deliberate, as though someone had placed a lit handle directly on the wood. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was just my overactive imagination. After all, the cabin itself was cozy, plush couches, a fireplace stocked with wood, and a view of the mountains through the massive windows. This was supposed to be my escape, wasn't it? Still, the silence pressed down on me. Outside, the forest was as quiet as the cabin. No rustling leaves, no bird song, not even the wind. It was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware, sir. Your own breathing. I found the candles in a box near the fireplace, exactly as Ethan had said they'd be. They were thick and white, with wicks already blackened from previous use. A single matchbox sat on top of them, its sides worn smooth. There were just enough candles for each room. As I picked them up, the scent of wax grew stronger, almost choking, like it had soaked into the very walls of the cabin. The attic door caught my attention as I made my way through the house. It was locked. The padlock, shiny and new, out of place in the otherwise rustic setting. For a moment I hesitated, staring at the door. It felt like it was watching me. I moved on, lighting candles in each room. As the flames flickered to life, the shadows in the cabin seemed to shift, deepening in the corners of the rooms. By the time I finished, the sun had begun to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I counted the rooms again, double-checking my work. That's when I realized I'd missed one. The attic. I stood in the hallway, staring at the locked door, a knot of unease forming in my stomach. It's just one room, I whispered to myself. It'll be fine. But as the sun disappeared and the candlelight became the only source of warmth, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The shadows came alive as night fell, but instead it twisted the corners of the cabin into something sinister. Every step I took, every creak of the wooden floor, felt amplified in the silence. I had tried to ignore the attic. It was locked, after all, and I convinced myself that missing one candle wouldn't matter. But the air in the cabin felt heavier, like it was pushing down on me. The faint scent of melted wax grew stronger, clinging to the back of my throat. I sat in the living room, my eyes darting to the attic door at the end of the hallway. The padlock. Face gleamed in the dim light, and for a moment, I thought I saw it tremble. I told myself it was a trick of the light. At exactly midnight, the knocking began. It was soft at first, coming from the front door. Just 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze, the matchbox in my hand slipping to the floor. My heart pounded as the knocking came again, louder this time. I forced myself to stand, inching toward the door. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see someone, anyone. The knocking stopped, replaced by a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps creaking from the attic above me. I stared at the locked door at the end of the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. The attic was supposed to be locked. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth above me. Each creak was deliberate, taunting, as if whoever or whatever was up there knew I was listening. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't just sit there, now with the sound growing louder, closer. Hallway, its padlock glinting mockingly in the candlelight. Stay calm, I whispered to myself, though my voice shook. I inched forward, every step feeling like a mile. When I reached the attic door, I pressed my ear, bent against it, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then, a voice whispered from the other side. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Come up. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The silence was worse than the noise. And then the knocking started again, this time from the windows. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the glass. Shadows moved just beyond the flickering. The glow of the candles, shapeless figures shifting in the dark. The knocking grew more insistent, coming from all sides now. The windows, the walls, the front door. The attic door creaked, the padlock trembling against its hinges. I realized with a sickening twist in my gut that the cabin wasn't keeping something out. It was keeping something in. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed down on me, thick and suffocating, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. I stayed frozen, gripping the flashlight in one hand, the matchbox in the other. My heart pounded as I scanned the room for anything out of place. That's when I saw something poking out from under the couch cushions. A journal. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was frantic, messy, like someone had been scribbling in a panic. The entries described everything I was experiencing. The rules, the candles, the shadows that seemed to shift and move just beyond the light. One line stopped me cold. The candles are not for you. They are for I. I flipped to the next page, my breath catching at the words. If you forget the attic, it wakes up. A chill ran down my spine. I looked toward the hallway, where the attic door loomed at the end, locked and menacing. I turned to the last page, hoping for an answer, but it only offered one. Haunting sentence. The cabin only needs one mistake. A creak snapped me out of my trance, my head whipped toward the sound. The attic door. The padlock was gone. It creaked open slowly, spilling darkness into the hallway like thick smoke. From the shadows, a voice whispered, "Come up." I bolted for the front door. My only thought was to get out, to leave the cabin and its horrors behind me. But with each step, the hallway seemed to stretch, growing longer and darker. The walls groaned, the wood twisting as if the cabin itself was alive. I tripped, hitting the floor hard. My flashlight rolled out of my hand, its beam casting flickering shadows across the room. The door, which had been just a few steps away, now felt impossibly dark. Scrambling to my feet, I reached the living room. My eyes darted to the kitchen table where I left my keys, but the table was gone. Panic clawed at my chest as the air grew thicker, heavier. Shadows danced at the edges of the room, creeping closer with each passing second. Every door I tried was locked. Every window was sealed shut. The cabin didn't want me to leave. Then the knocking started again, louder this time. It came from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. It reverberated through my skull, deafening and inescapable. I screamed, pounding on the front door. "Let me out!" The knocking stopped. Behind me, the voice came again, soft and taunting. "Come up!" I turned toward the attic. The door was wide open, the darkness inside spilling out like smoke. I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the cabin left me no choice. Shadows had closed in, their forms flickering like candle flames, blocking every other path. "Come up," the voice whispered again, louder this time, almost coaxing. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight as the air grew colder, my breath visible in front of me. At the top of the stairs, the attic stretched out, empty except for a single unlit candle in the center of the room. The wax was pristine, but the air reeked of burning. The walls were covered in symbols, carvings that seemed to twist and pulse as I stared at them. And then I saw the shadows. Humanoid figures lined up along the walls, their featureless faces. They all turned toward me. "Light it," the voice demanded, filling the room, reverberating in my skull. With trembling hands, I struck a match. The shadows stepped closer, their forms rippling like smoke. The match flared, the small flame dancing in the suffocating air. When I touched it to the candle's wick, the shadows screamed, a sound so unnatural it made my knees buckle. The flame burned black, consuming the room in darkness. When the light returned, the attic was empty. The candle was gone. I stumbled out of the cabin into the first rays of dawn, gasping for air, convinced it was over, until I got home and found the attic candle on my nightstand. Its wick was still smoldering. I thought the worst was over when I stumbled out into the dawn, the cabin fading into the mist. Behind me, way without looking back, the road twisting down the mountain as the trees closed in like sentinels, watching my escape. But deep down, I knew I wasn't free. The first sign came 3 nights later. I found the attic candle on my kitchen table, pristine and unlit, though I had locked my house before bed. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The wax felt warm, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. A note was tucked beneath it, written in jagged letters. "Your turn to feed it." At first I told myself it was a sick prank, but then the shadows began to move. They stretched across the walls, clawing and twisting when there was no light to cast them. Objects in my home shifted without sound. My chair slightly turned. The fridge door left ajar, the TV flickering too. Static at midnight. And then, last night, the knocking started. Soft at first, just like before. 3 gentle taps on my bedroom window, though I live on the 3rd floor. The whispers followed, low and familiar, repeating my name over and over, growing louder until they drowned out my thoughts. I'm writing this now with the candle beside me, the matchbox shaking in my hands. I don't know what happens if I light it, but the shadows are getting closer. I can feel their breath on the back of my neck, hear the faint scrape of claws against the walls. The cabin hasn't forgotten me. It never does. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer. Every word draws its gaze. Do you hear knocking tonight? Are you sure it's just the wind? Or is something waiting for you too? Something stares from the chapel's shattered windows, its gaze as cold as the grave. Tried to leave. The forest twisted around me, trapping me in its endless maze. Now the whispers from the chapel call my name, promising that I'll never escape. The forest had never felt so suffocating. The trees, tall and knotted with age, seemed to lean inward, trapping the air in a dense, unnatural silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the brittle underbrush. I'd come out here to escape the city, hoping the forest's solitude might quiet my thoughts, but instead, it felt like stepping into a forgotten graveyard. Then I saw it. A chapel, ancient and skeletal, stood half buried behind a tangle of ivy and shadow. Its steeple was crooked, a spire that seemed to claw at the overcast sky. Jagged, reflected nothing. The doors hung ajar as if waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside. My breath hitched. Whispers, soft, distant, floated on the still air. I froze, scanning the forest, or the source, but the sound grew louder the closer I moved to the chapel. It wasn't words, but a low, guttural murmur that scraped against my ears, stirring something primal inside me. I stepped forward, drawn against my better judgment. The air thickened, pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Just beyond the door I could make out the faint outline of a figure, but when I blinked it was gone. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed to turn around, too. But turning would simply mean potentially losing her. An ominous premonition, much like the first one, had prompted me to turn, run. But my feet didn't listen. Something about the chapel felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream or a nightmare. The door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the hollow interior. Inside, the chapel was dark and damp, its wooden pews warped with age. Sunlight spilled in through the broken windows, illuminating the dust that hung thick in the air. The smell hit me next, mold and decay, with an undercurrent of something metallic, like rust or blood. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed strange carvings etched into the pews. They weren't random marks, but deliberate symbols, their jagged lines twisting unnaturally as if alive. My stomach turned as I brushed my fingers over one. It felt warm, almost pulsing. Then I saw it, a leather-bound journal sitting on the altar. It didn't belong here. The cover was unmarked, but when I opened it, I was met with pages of frantic writing in a language I didn't recognize. The words seemed to writhe, refusing to be read, except for one phrase that stood out, scrawled over and over, "The forest keeps what it takes." A chill ran through me. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The chapel seemed to breathe around me, its walls creaking, its shadows deepening. I slammed the journal shut and spun toward the door, but the whispering only grew louder, like laughter mocking my panic. I needed to leave. Now. The journal felt heavier than it should as I clutched it to my chest and pushed open the chapel doors. I stepped outside, the air dense and cold, and froze. The path I had taken, the one I was sure of, was gone. In its place, the forest stood impossibly dense, the trees so tightly packed, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. My stomach twisted. This wasn't how the forest looked before. I turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of it. But no matter which way I faced, the trees seemed closer, leaning in with silent menace. Panic surged through me. I picked a direction and began walking, but after what felt like hours of stumbling through underbrush and roots that seemed to snag my feet intentionally, I emerged into a clearing. The clearing wasn't new. The chapel stood before me, unchanged. My breath hitched. I'd been walking the opposite way, hadn't I? Trunks. Mocking. Growing louder with every step. They weren't words. They were guttural sounds, scraping at the edges of my sanity. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. I blinked and realized I was back in the clearing, burned inside. The sun plummeted from the sky, leaving me in utter darkness. The glow from the chapel. Windows grew brighter, casting flickering shadows that danced unnaturally across the clearing. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. From inside the chapel came a sound that turned my blood to ice, laughter, faint, distant, and impossibly familiar. The laughter didn't stop. It ebbed and flowed, rising to a cackle before fading into silence, only to start again. My feet carried me forward, back toward the chapel, though every instinct begged me to stay away. As I stepped through the doorway, I realized the interior had changed. The air was stifling, thick with a strange heat that made the walls appear to pulse like living flesh. The carvings on the pews writhed, twisting and curling in the corner of my eye, though. When I turned to look directly, they froze. A metallic tang filled the air, sharp and bitter, like blood. I forced myself to approach the altar. The journal was still in my hands, though I didn't firmly remember picking it back up. My fingers trembled as I set it down and stepped away, noticing for the first time how cold and clear it was, my heart racing. The first time the uneven boards beneath the altar, one plank was loose. Against every shred of reason, I knelt and pulled it free. A hidden trapdoor. My pulse roared in my ears as I pried it open. A staircase descended into the earth, glowing, faintly red, as though hell itself waited below. I wanted to run, but my legs betrayed me, carrying, merged mountainward, step by step. The basement smelled of rust and rot. The walls were lined with rough-hewn stone, damp and sticky to the touch. At the center of the room, a circle of ash surrounded burning candles that dripped no wax. And there, at the circle's center, lay a photograph, a child's face, smudged and faded, but unmistakable. It was me. The journal, impossibly, was back in my hands, its pages turned on their own, stopping at a single line scrawled in a jagged hand. You were always meant to return. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the forest floor, my body stiff and cold, as if hours had passed, had changed again. The trees, gnarled and towering, bent inward like spectators to a grim ritual. Their twisted trunks resembled human forms, faces contorted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. Where I turned, the whispers returned, faint at first, but this time they carried form. Edge of my vision, darting between the trees. They were fast, too fast to see clearly, but I could feel their presence, cold and oppressive, like a hand squeezing my throat. Hush! I ran. My legs burned. My breath came in panicked gasps. But the forest had no end. The shadows didn't chase me. They guided me, subtly nudging me back to where I started. The clearing, the chapel, again and again. Each time, it felt closer, more suffocating, as if the forest, we were folding in on itself. Then the memories began. Flashes of a child's cries echoed in my mind. I could hear a woman's voice screaming my name, desperate and anguished. The images didn't belong to me, but they were so vivid they felt like my own. Shadow dragging him into the dark. Was that me? No, it couldn't be. A sudden, searing pain shot through my wrist. I stumbled, clutching it, and saw the mark. A jagged symbol burned into my skin. It pulsed faintly, glowing like an ember, matching the rhythm of the whispers. I stared at it, shaking, as the truth began to unravel. I wasn't lost. I was being led. My feet moved without thought, pulling me back to the chapel. I didn't want to return, but something deep inside compelled me. The trapdoor was open when I reached it, and the red light from below bled out in pulsating waves. The whispers turned to a hum, vibrating through. The air hummed through my chest, pulling me down the staircase like a marionette on strings. The basement had changed. The walls seemed alive now, their surface rippling like flesh. The circle of ash burned brighter, and at its center, the void had expanded. A black abyss that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. I stood frozen, my legs trembling, as a form began to rise. From it, it emerged slowly, impossibly tall, its body a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and bone. Eyes and mouths shifted across its face, opening and closing with no rhythm or purpose. Its presence crushed me, the air thick with an ancient, malevolent energy. Aloud, but in my mind its voice deep and resonant, shaking my very soul. You belong to me. My legs buckled and I collapsed to my knees. Memories, no, fragments of truths, rushed in. This wasn't the first time I'd been here. I'd come as a child, drawn by the same whispers, marked by the same entity. I had escaped, but the mark it left ensured my return. The entity leaned closer, its shifting face mere inches from mine. Takes, it growled. It offered me a choice. Stay and serve it, or let it take someone I loved. Tears blurred my vision. My voice cracked as I begged, pleaded for a third option, but the entity only laughed, its countless mouths grinning in unison. There was no escape, only a cruel, impossible decision. The void swirled, pulling at me like a living thing, as the entity's countless mouths twisted into mocking smiles. Its demand echoed in my mind, stay and serve, or sacrifice another. My heart pounded, my vision blurred, and I screamed the only word I could manage. No! I didn't stay to see its reaction. I turned and bolted up the stairs, the journal still clutched in my hand. Behind me, the basement. Walls groaned as if the chapel itself was alive, furious at my defiance. The air was heavy with reptilian sounds. Whispers, now screams, all merging into a single deafening roar. My legs burned as I pushed forward, but the door wouldn't budge. Then it flung open on its own, the force throwing me into the clearing. The forest, now alive with movement, seemed to recoil as I stumbled forward. The trees bent and twisted, their branches clawing at my skin as I ran. The whispers transformed into wails, shrill and piercing, each one a voice screaming my name. I tripped, hitting the ground hard. But I didn't stop. Something moved behind me. Heavy. Footsteps. Dragging like dead weight. I didn't dare look back. The tree line broke suddenly, spilling me onto a deserted road. The screams ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Headlights pierced the darkness and the driver pulled over, his face concerned, but I couldn't. When I looked back, the forest and the chapel were gone. Relief began to creep in, until I noticed my wrist. The mark glowed faintly, the edges pulsing, like a heartbeat. A low, guttural chuckle echoed in my mind. You can't outrun what you are. Tears streamed down my face as I realized the truth. It wasn't over. It would never be over. I didn't go home right away. How could I? The mark on my wrist pulsed like a heartbeat. Its glow, faint, but relentless. It didn't hurt. It ached. A deep, twisting pain that spread through my chest. With each throb, the driver who had stopped for me asked if I was okay, his words a blur. I could only nod. I couldn't explain what had happened, not when I didn't understand it myself. Weeks passed. The nightmares started almost immediately. Each night, I'd wake drenched in sweat, the whispers from the forest still echoing in my ears, the twisted trees, the endless shadows, the void. They haunted me, slipping into every corner of my mind, and always, at the edge of my dreams, I could feel it watching, waiting. Then the package arrived. No return address, just a plain brown envelope. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was the photograph, the same one I'd found in the chapel, charred and brittle. The child's face was burned away this time, but the message scrawled on the back remained. It's your turn. The mark on my wrist burned, searing into my skin. I dropped the photo, my breath hitching. But the whispers returned, louder now, deafening, filling the room. The lights flickered, plunging me into darkness. And then I heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, like a child's giggle, but it grew louder, deeper, more guttural. Shadows crept, and then vines crept all around it, along the walls, their shapes twisting unnaturally, forming jagged figures that shouldn't exist. My heart pounded as I backed into the corner, my eyes darting wildly, searching for something, anything. But there was nowhere left to run. Then it spoke. The voice was low, vibrating through the room and deep into my skull. Escape. You belong to us now. The lights came back on, but I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the corner, shrouded in shadow. Its form too tall, its limbs too long. Its eyes, hundreds of them, opened at once, all fixed on me. I screamed, but no sound came out. If you dare, share this story, but be warned. Every time it's retold, the forest grows stronger. Every time someone reads these words, its reach spreads a little further. Are you sure you're safe where you are, or is something already watching from the shadows?